In my role, I think the biggest challenge and the opportunity is to really reimagine what clinical data management is. I think even though a lot of the context for how we do the work from a technology standpoint, process standpoint, that's changed over time, the real guts of what we do and how we go about that has essentially been the same for several decades. If you think about clinical data management being about acquiring data initially from sites, running that through a series of central checks to make sure that it's valid, and then questioning back to the site if it's not, and then finally turning a data package over to somebody downstream like a statistician to make a decision. That essentially hasn't changed through really the last several decades. And increasingly, that process is just not good enough for what we demand of clinical research, whether it's the speed that we need to make decisions or the initial quality and the burden of getting to that quality places on the sites. So I see tremendous opportunity for really revolutionizing how we do clinical data management. I think it starts up front with the sites when we think about how we're interacting with sites. And again, the historic process of generating data and then sending queries back has become an accepted practice. But that's really not a practice that's accepted in any other industry, any other business process. If you imagine ordering something off of Amazon.com and several days or weeks later getting a query from them asking, did you really mean to order that? That would just never fly. You would never run a business that way. And yet in clinical research, we do that hundreds or thousands of times on any given trial. So when we think about how other industries conduct e-business, and then now we're at a point of being able to do that as well, we can apply similar methodologies, similar tools to think about how we interact with sites better up front, making our questions to them clearer, making the instruments easier to understand, easier to give us data, more mistake-proof. And then to be able to look at the data generated from them very early on and interacting with sites to correct the path that they're on if we see that that's off track with respect to quality and integrity, rather than waiting until after the fact and checking it in afterwards. I think once we get the data internally, we can also leverage some of the other methodologies and process changes in the industry, like with risk-based monitoring. If you think about what's happening in that process, we're doing a very rigorous risk assessment process up front, and then tailoring all of the central and site monitoring to that risk assessment. So we're focusing all the activity on the most important aspects to the trial, and we're using very powerful analytics to interrogate the data and ensure that we understand the trends in a way that we can focus that attention on those issues. We can apply that same methodology to clinical data management, starting again with that risk assessment process, rather than take the blunt force approach of looking at every issue that we can imagine and run any edits and queries and listings and reports to look at those sorts of issues. We can now focus attention on those issues that are most relevant, and we can do that also with analytics that really incisively get to the most important issues and focus the data management activities and the querying process on those issues. I think what our industry needs to do in order to drive this revolution in clinical data management is to really largely get out of our own way. I think that if we look at regulatory agencies, I often hear people say, well, we need to do such and such step because it's expected from the agency or required by regulation. And then we find out that's not actually the case when we interact with agencies. They're very eager, maybe more so than industry, to find ways to deliver drugs faster with high quality to patients. And they're interested in making sure that there's not unnecessary bureaucracy in the way of that. A lot of times, it's the industry ourselves that are so risk averse to being able to take steps to make ourselves leaner and more efficient. And this is an example of that. So some of the practices that, again, are inherent to clinical data management, we can challenge those. We can look for whether they're truly adding value. Again, similar to risk-based monitoring, we have great data that says source data verification doesn't really add much value. And that's why it's been so much easier to interact with agencies around a different methodology that reduces the focus on that and replacing that with a methodology that gets us better quality. We can look to other industries for inspiration. It's really fascinating to me to see how other industries have transformed themselves over time, especially in how they utilize data that they're generating themselves to improve their own business practices. Again, you can look at any e-retailer and look at not only how they've made the upfront process of interacting with customers and suppliers very easy and intuitive, but then they also mine that data that's being corrected in real time to iterate their business process, to understand the flow of the information, the flow of the product, the inventory, even making business decisions off of that data in real time. And that's really where we as an industry are trying to get to. When we think about adaptive clinical trials, adaptive clinical programs, we're needing to get to a point where we're making decisions in real time that are off of data that today we would take months or longer to really get to a point where we're confident to be able to make that decision. So it might be that the resources we spend in clinical data management are a fraction of what we're spending on the entire clinical program, or the time for a given data lock is relatively short when we think about the entirety of the timeline to get to submission. But the speed of decision making is the key to reducing years off of our cycle time and hundreds of millions of dollars off of the cost. And that comes down to a better, smarter use of data, and that's what we can look at other industries for.